Welcome to a brand new episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning into the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that will have you coming back for more content. And if you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I thank you and I hope that today's episode is one that you will find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. But before we get to the main event, just a reminder, if you're watching from YouTube, make sure you hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new content. And if you're listening from Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts, make sure you subscribe there as well. Also, for those who want to help us continue building this platform, there are a few ways you can go about doing that. For those who've been with us from the beginning, and you know what we deliver here with IDTALK4ED Educators Live, you can go ahead and become a patron today by joining our community on Patreon. There, you'll be able to get access to exclusive content and behind-the-scenes content on how we do things at IDTALK. Now, maybe you're somebody who is new and you're still learning more about this platform, and you're not ready to make that kind of commitment. Well, alternatively, you can go ahead and donate to any of these three platforms. So we have Cash App, where you can use the handle # IDTALK4ED, Venmo, where you can use the handle @KwameSM, or you can donate to PayPal, where you can type in the URL paypal.me/KwameSM. And if you want to catch up on past episodes of the podcast, as always, you can go ahead to our main website at identitytalk4educators.com. And one more announcement, as many of you already know who've been following this podcast, I do have a new book out called Learn to Relearn, Supporting Identity in a Culturally Affirming Classroom. And this is the book that is needed during this day and time with everything going on in our world. It is currently on pre-order on Amazon and Routledge. You could also go to our main website at learntorelearn.com to learn more about the chapters, as well as some of the background content that you will find in the book and the resources that will help you as you prepare for a brand new school year. So a lot of good stuff for you all to check out while you wait for the release of the book. Also, for my people who love Kindle, the Kindle version is officially out, so you can go ahead and pre-order that as well if you're not a paperback person. And there'll be more information to come as we talk more about this book leading up to the release day in November. But as always, thank you all for supporting, and I can't wait to dive in once this book gets out to the universe. All right, people, so we're going to do things a little bit differently today. And I can't believe it took 177 episodes for this to happen. But here we are, 2024. And I have two good friends of mine who are going to be serving as guest co-hosts today. And we're going to flip the table. So right now, I'm going to be the guest. So there are people who have asked me questions about my story, my background, how I started the podcast, how I became an educator. And these are things that I've shared in previous episodes, bits and pieces. I've also gone on other people's platforms to share about my story. But this will be the first time that you all will get a real deep dive into who Kwame Sarfo-Mensah is. And I know this is probably something I should have done 5 years ago, but listen, better late than never, right? So I'm going to go ahead and bring on my two co-hosts, and they're going to take it away. So I'm going to bring on MaryAnn DeRosa, and I'm going to bring on Maymouna Sakho, who have been previous guests on this podcast. So make sure you check out their episodes. They're going to go ahead and facilitate the conversation. And hopefully by the end of it, you'll learn a lot more about my life and why I do what I do. So let's get it cracking.
Hey.
Hi, everyone.
What's going on? Hey, how are
Thanks
we?
for having us. This is really exciting.
Yeah, thank you all for pushing me to do this.
I'm of the motto of it's never too late. It's all in the perfect timing. This is when this story and this interview wouldn't work out if it wasn't me and MaryAnn doing it. So let's just get that out there right now. Dr. MaryAnn DeRosa and Maymouna Sakho. This is the sauce you needed, so it's okay.
We want to learn and hear from you, Kwame. We were talking about it. We're like, hey, what's this Kwame all about? He's always talking, meeting all these people. How does he do that? Like, what is the magic there? So I'm really excited to learn more about you and your thinking process. What's going on in your head right there?
It's crazy how MaryAnn and I got to the same conclusion separately when we were talking with you for our episodes. I was like, when are we going to talk to you separately and hear about your story? So perfect timing. I think it's well overdue. Thank you for having us. Thank you for trusting us as well to share your story.
Oh, I trust y'all all my heart. Couldn't think of two better co-hosts to do this. So thank you all for taking this on.
So I want to start a little bit about your educational journey. Kwame, born on a Saturday, Ghanaian name, my Ghanaian peoples. Can you share a little bit about your earliest childhood memory and how identity at that point in time sort of shaped you?
Well, I'll fast forward a little bit because a lot of things that I've said in previous podcasts, people can check out. But a little bit about me. I was born in the United States. Both my parents are from Ghana, as Maymouna mentioned. And they came to the States in the late 60s, right at the height of the civil rights movement. So just to give you context of how things were, I mean, they were trying to find their way as immigrants in the United States. And fast forward, I was born and my three other siblings were born. And in terms of my identity, I just knew that growing up in the United States, I was a Black boy.
Mm.
And most of my friends were Black. So that was my primary identifier. I knew that I had Ghanaian heritage, but it wasn't something that was strongly emphasized in the household. Yeah, we ate Ghanaian food. We had the fufu. We had the fried plantain. We had the jollof rice. We had all the cuisine. But in terms of the other aspects of the culture, those weren't things that were strongly imposed on myself or any of my siblings. So as far as me being in school, it was rough because I started off in a self-contained special education classroom. So my first 4 years, I had an IEP, and I was in the same room as folks who had other disabilities, whether it be autism, ADHD, students who had Asperger's. We were all in the same classroom. So this is early 90s, just to give you all the context. And when you had any kind of association with that setting, that led to your peers ridiculing you. They call you names like retard, or they'd say, how come you're not riding the big yellow bus? You in the small van. Because at that time, if you were in a small van, that was an indicator that you weren't in the mainstream. Mm-hmm. So these were the experiences that I had early on. And I knew that I was separate from a lot of other kids in my class. And then being significantly darker than everybody else, that didn't help. So there comes the colorism. So you have kids taking milk carts, Hershey's chocolate milk cart, and they're comparing your face to the milk carton to see which one is darker. They call you Hershey's chocolatey and all kinds of things. And then I have a full Ghanaian name, no English name. So my name stands out. And this is around Lion King time. So you have the Africa jokes, you got the roots jokes. So I got the full barrage. And the more you hear it, the more you start to internalize those messages. And in a way, that played a role in shaping my identity at that time. So that was the early years. Mm-hmm. And then eventually I would end up moving to Ghana after my 6th grade year with my little sister and my father. And I lived there for 3 years. Mm-hmm. And it was at that time where I really started to learn about my culture. I started to connect and reconnect with different family members. I was in a classroom where I looked like everybody, well, phenotypically, but as soon as I opened my mouth, they knew, oh, you know, you're not from here, but we like you because you have the American accent. So you start to learn those little things there. But that was a little bit my early childhood.
I'm going to back up a little bit.
Sure.
So what I understood was, and I think we all experienced that, if you're brown or of the hues of brown, or even a little bit different in the United States, kids find a reason to pick on you for whatever, right? But my question or clarifying point is, You mentioned that you were in a self-contained class. So for our listeners, Google it, but I'll give you a little synopsis. Self-contained is a classroom where everyone in the classroom has some sort of disability, right? And so at the time, coming from Ghana, being born there, did you feel like your parents didn't really know the system? Like, how did that end up happening to you?
From what I remember, for what my mom told me, I had issues with speech. So I was very nonverbal. Not that I didn't have the ability to speak, I just chose not to speak. And rather than speaking to people, I would resort to drawing pictures or writing. I was super shy.
Okay.
And that's what led to me getting the IEP. I'm sorry, individualized education plan. So that's what it was. And it wasn't a case where I couldn't do the work. I was still being pushed in to certain mainstream classes during those 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I would get opportunities to mingle with other peers. But for majority of the instructional day, I was in that setting. And I knew that it wasn't a clean fit, but you couldn't tell my peers anything. You know, they saw what they saw, and that was the perception.
I'm wondering about, you just said you didn't know where you fit. And I'm wondering, how did you develop a sense of belonging, or did you have one? You know, kids are craving that belonging or that community. And what was your community? Where did you find that?
I found it within my neighborhood. So I had friends within my neighborhood, and we connected through video games and sports. So at that time, it was all about getting out the house, riding your Huffy bike.
Love that. Yes.
Everybody had a Huffy dirt bike at that time.
No helmet.
Where you had a back pedal to brake.
Oh, yeah.
We have the gears.
Hopping
banana seat.
Hopping wheelies.
Yep. You already know. So I was able to connect with people through sports. So I like to tell people I was Steph Curry before Steph Curry on the basketball court. I couldn't dribble to save my life, but I could shoot threes from the half court line. Like, I had that type of jump. You can ask my brother. You can ask people who grow with me. The jumper is what kept me on the court. Just stand outside perimeter, got it. And that's how I was able to get props. And then my brother was the cool one. He had all the friends in the neighborhood. He was popular in school. The girls had a liking to him. So he was the original idol for me. And just by being my brother, just by being Sarfo's little brother, that gave me props too. So it helped to have a brother who was cool and was popular in school, because then it allowed for other people to lay off of me a little bit. It gave me some layer of protection.
Yeah, I was watching those mini documentaries from like Boston TV. That's so cool. For the listeners, if you can, go out and find these little content pieces. I'm not sure, are they on TV, Kwame? Those?
They might have been, but I only saw it online. So if you're referring to the 2-minute documentary I did with WGH, yeah, that was.
And you had mentioned that the sports was what like kind of drove you, and in high school and you wanted to be a professional athlete, but then somehow that didn't work out for you. And nope. But I did want to mention what really stood out to me. Well, there are a lot of things stood out to me, but one thing that you said as you were talking about your background was that you said that humble beginnings, being a child of immigrant parents, give birth to this idea of being motivated. And I think that Maymouna and I can, as children of immigrants to the U.S. as well, I think we all, probably our listeners who are children of immigrants, can be like, yeah, 100% in my family, you know, these humble beginnings gave us that drive to achieve. And now I'm wondering, like, how, now that you're kind of at the top of your field, of your discipline, how do you hold on to those humble beginnings and like hold on to that drive?
You know, MaryAnn, I still got a chip on my shoulder.
Yeah.
I still feel like I have something to prove. And that's what allows me to maintain the drive to thrive. I always think back to those beginnings when people count me out. I always think about those beginnings when I was being teased and ridiculed. And to be in this position today where I'm an educator and I publish books and I'm doing podcasts, all these things I'm mentioning are antithetical to my learning profile back then
Mm-hmm.
because I wasn't the strongest writer in class. Writing, anything literacy based, was my weakest subject. I did well, but that's because I was a hard worker. Math is where I thrive. Math is what came naturally to me. So to be here facilitating conversations, moderating panels, hosting a podcast, this wasn't supposed to happen, but I'm doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Writing 3 books, that wasn't supposed to happen, but I'm doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Teaching in the classroom for over 10 years, that was not part of the plan. Well, God said it was part of the plan. I just didn't know it until later on, but I'm doing it.
Right.
So when I think about humble beginnings, I think about those trials and tribulations that I went through. I think about those negative forces that were imposed on me that propelled me to be who I ultimately became. But it wasn't something that happened overnight. It's something that humbles you, especially now that I am a father and I have 2 sons that I have to look out for. I always have to remind myself of those moments.
I like how you talked about those experiences and how it propelled you. And in particular, there's a connection, of course, between MaryAnn and I, because we work in inclusion, right? That's our thing. That's our baby. That's what we believe in. And so naturally, it made sense after hearing a little bit about your background for us to have this conversation with you. But I think MaryAnn and I are always trying to be that teacher or that adult that for students who are in the classroom who are struggling, that when they make it or when they overcome that, we're the ones that, not in a savioristic way, but in some capacity, we were able to advocate and help them. Do you find that there's someone from your past or even currently, I don't know, a teacher that you feel helped you to overcome some of the things that you were challenged with when you were younger?
Yes, and I talk about her in my first book, Shaping the Teacher Identity. Her name was Brenda Martin. So Mrs. Martin was my teacher for most of those first 4 years. I was in that self-contained classroom. She was my homeroom teacher, and she was the teacher who really saw me in a different light compared to my peers. She saw the good in me, and she always highlighted the positive and was always someone who empowered you to go beyond what you believe you can do, even at that age. So when I had that confidence from her, I felt like I could do everything. I didn't feel like I was inadequate when I was in that classroom. And because she was somebody who not only was an empower, she was also somebody that worked well with parents, including my mom. Her and my mom partnered really well when it came to my development. And she had enough humility to listen to my mom and take on some of the tips that my mom was sharing with her that was working at home. You don't see that in every teacher. Y'all know this. Not every teacher has that humility to listen to a parent and apply that advice to the classroom setting. But Mrs. Martin did that. And when I became a teacher 20 plus years later, I knew that I wanted to be a teacher similar to her who would empower students. So I thank her for giving me that inspiration.
Can I add to that? Thank you for sharing that. And I think part of it too is you had a parent who's willing to understand even if they didn't know. And so I think when you have a child, which we know from our work and just the work that you as well, being in a classroom, when you have a child who's challenged with a disability, there's so many ways that it can go. And there are a lot of parents who are in denial, and there are a lot of parents who are also accepting, and there are some that are in between. Right. And so it sounds like your mom and your dad or your family in general, they recognize that you needed a little bit more help. And perhaps the setting of where you were at that time, we're talking about the 90s, was a little too restrictive. But the fact that they knew and saw, okay, there's some things that I cannot do for Kwame, so let me figure out how I can use the educational system to support him. I think that was a huge plus, and kudos to your parents for that as well. And being receptive to the feedback that your teacher was giving you.
Yes.
African parents aren't always receptive, huh?
Yeah, for sure. And well, really, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, well, thank you to Miss Martin, because you started out saying that you were in there for being kind of a quiet kid, almost nonverbal, and here we are on your podcast. So I'd love to move on to talk about your podcast.
Sure.
Yeah, you are nearing 200 episodes of Identity Talk. That is amazing, especially for a kid who didn't really like to talk. So tell us a little bit about how it all began.
So it kind of happened by accident. So in 2019, July 2019, my family and I moved to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, because my wife got a director job with the U.S. Peace Corps. So that's what's kept us abroad all these years. And the original plan was to continue teaching in the classroom and apply at an international school. But once I saw how difficult it was to get my foot in the door, I started to get frustrated. And I was also getting anxious too, because it was the first time in 15 years that I was not starting the school year in a school setting, not setting up a classroom, not doing lesson plans or calling parents or looking at seating charts. I had absolutely nothing to do because I had domestic help. You have a housekeeper. You have a nanny that helps to take care of your children. You have a security guard that's out there 24/7 because they're part of the U.S. mission. And then you have a driver that takes your kids and you wherever you need to go. All those things were things that my wife and I used to do for ourselves. So when those things were taken care of, now it's like, well, shoot, what's there for me to do? And I started to get stir crazy. So fast forward to December, I said, well, if I can't get into a classroom, I'm going to go ahead and create my own classroom and be nosy and learn about the stories of folks who are doing this work. Because I still want to be connected. And I figured since I'm international now, I could reach out to folks all over the globe. So December 2019 is when I recorded my first ever episode of this podcast. At the time, it wasn't like this with StreamYard and all the fancy background. It was simple Zoom, hit record, let the guest talk for an hour, hit record again to stop it, and then you upload it right away to YouTube. So no editing, nothing, just raw. Very, very raw.
Wow.
Yeah. But here's the thing, though. At first, it was just to stay connected, but then I started to realize, I could do other things off of this podcast. There are a lot of things that could spin off from it. So over the past 5 years, I've been able to organize a virtual conference at the height of COVID. And the featured presenters were past guests of this podcast. I've been able to do e-courses on different content that I've put out there.
Wow.
I've been able to even get book deals, like this book deal that I got to write Learn to Relearn. A reason why that happened was because people saw the podcast and saw what was possible. Even the panel that I moderated, the reason why I was able to moderate that panel was because people at Ghana ACD saw the episodes and said, hey, this is somebody that knows how to facilitate a conversation. He'll be a good person to moderate the panel. So, and I think the biggest thing about the podcast, and I wrote this in a piece for the International Educator, it's that it's the ultimate networking tool. When you interview somebody, you give somebody uninterrupted time to just talk about themselves. I don't think people realize how big of a gift that is. Now, Maymouna, you know how that is because you do this as well. When you're able to give people that time to just talk about themselves and you're affirming them, you're honoring them, you give them their flowers. And then once the recording stops, you're able to have a conversation because during that whole hour, you all built a relationship in that 1 hour of recording. Now we could talk on a deeper level. Now that I've given you time and space to share about yourself, now let me talk to you about who I am. And then from there, you start to build these networks, which then could lead to potential opportunities. So it's just been awesome to be close to 200 episodes and to think that I've been talking to that many educators from different parts of the globe. I could not have imagined it, honestly.
Well, I'm going to let Maymouna take on because she is a podcast host as well, an interviewer. But I think this is amazing. Like just listening to you, I'm like, wow, like the thinking. I mean, I know it just kind of came from this like idea that you had, but then just the way that you think about things, again, from those humble beginnings. So it's this motivation, there's this kind of build up towards I'm building, I'm doing, I'm always doing, right? That's the immigrant mentality. I'm going to do one thing, but actually I'm going to do 10 things with this, right?
Right.
You never do one thing, right? You always have 2 jobs, 3 jobs, I think, but that's amazing. So thank you for sharing that.
But I also think that this podcast, I mean, as I said, I never believe that nothing is just by accident. But from just hearing about your background and knowing what we know about you, I think at the younger age, you were craving that connection that felt like it was absent within the academic setting. You became a teacher and you became the individual that you wanted when you were younger. And so I feel like the podcast is a continuation of that connection, because when you went to Addis, there was not the possibility to connect because you were no longer in the classroom the way it started. And so I think the podcast, I think you were right to start it when you did, because you allowed yourself to continue and strive and seek out that connection, and people responded. So in a way, I'm wondering, has this been, or has it served for you as a form of therapy? And you talked a little bit about your motivation to continue. I heard you say the networking, the connection with the individual, but 200 episodes is a lot, and you're cutting it up, trimming it, doing the sound. So what is it that's really motivating you to keep going, and what impact are you wanting to have with this podcast?
Maymouna, over time, I've started to realize how impactful this podcast has been to other people who have come up to me and said, man, Kwame, I've never said this before until I got on your podcast, or this is the first time I am sharing this story. Thank you for asking these questions. The more you hear these compliments and these affirmations, the more you realize that you're doing the work. I didn't really have that sense of identity, pun intended, in terms of what this podcast would be. I just thought this would be a pastime that I would do for a few episodes and then it would stop. But then once I saw the benefits that came with it and saw how it was having an impact on people, I couldn't just stop. I had to keep on going. And the one thing about podcasting is you got to keep momentum going. If you stop and you gone for a long period of time, that's the worst thing to your podcast. So you have to find ways to keep people engaged so that people will continue to tune in. But I think as my knowledge about identity grew, that's when the podcast started to grow. And I talk about this a little bit in my book, Learn to Relearn, which I know we'll get to in a little bit, about a situation with a previous guest of the podcast. So I mentioned in the beginning how I was doing this virtual conference. And the goal was to make it super diverse, try to hit the identity markers. I was really being very intersectional in my approach. That was my intention. But then I got a message from an indigenous educator who asked me, well, hey, are there going to be any indigenous educators presenting at this conference? And I was like, no, there won't be, because I don't really know any. So then this individual, and I'll share her name, Trisha Mokino, shout out to Trisha, she called me in and she started to tell me about how that perpetuates the settler colonialism that already happens in our society, the invisibilization of Native peoples throughout our country, how that's a perpetuation of that. And she started to break down some history and things like that. And I said, okay, we got to make this right. So I would love for you to come on the podcast so we can continue this conversation there. That way people can see that, hey, I can make mistakes too, but this could be a learning moment, not just for myself, but for other people who may have been in the same predicament. And funny enough, her and I are like this now. This happened 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And since then, she has been somebody who has taught me so much about the history of different tribal communities. She has directed me to literature, to read, people to listen to. She's also someone who I've met in person a couple times actually. So I actually went to Albuquerque, New Mexico for the Mid School Math Conference last year, and she's in that area. So I said, no, I'm gonna check her out.
Right.
So it was just beautiful. But that was just an example of what it meant to affirm somebody's identity. At that moment, I had to learn to relearn. The calling was my learn to relearn moment. And so I started to think, well, if I could do it with this individual, now I need to be curious about all these other identity markers. So then I started to be real selective in who I brought on. Okay, we don't talk enough about ableism. I'm going to bring on this expert who knows a lot about neurodivergent and can speak on special education. Okay, I don't know much about cis heteronormativity. Let me bring on someone who's from the LGBTQIA community to break that down and to let me know how is it impacting our school systems. Let me bring on somebody who is Asian American or Pacific Islander so we can talk about that. We could talk about xenophobia. We could talk about the minority myth and talk about how that's something that's more connected to East Asians and not the whole Asian continent. So making sure those distinctions are there. But these are things that I learned through the podcast, Maymouna. People have been teaching me. So I'm the host, but I'm also a student at the same time.
Right.
And thankfully, through those conversations, I was able to take excerpts from those conversations and include them in the book. So when you get your copy the next couple of months and you turn the pages, you'll come across past episodes of the podcast and excerpts from those episodes where I'm getting these teaching moments. And that's when I knew how special this podcast was and is becoming. That's what makes it Identity Talk, because we're digging. So this season, Identity Talk for Educators Live will be including ad spots for businesses, products, and events that are adding significant value to their communities. And here's the catch. You don't have to be an educator or an education-based business to be a part of this. We're looking for people who are just doing great work in the community, and we want to use our platform as a way to amplify their work. So if you are an entrepreneur or you know of an entrepreneur who is doing just that, bring them in our direction. Have them reach out to us. If they want to learn more about their ad spots and how they can get themselves promoted on this platform, they can contact myself, Kwame at identitytalk4educators.com. I'll say it one more time. It is Kwame at identitytalk4educators.com. Hope to hear from you, and let's keep on amplifying our work and building each other up.
Well, I'm wondering, as you're naming the differences among the folks you have interviewed and their different identity markers, I'm wondering, is there a commonality between all 200 interviews? Is there a common thread that keeps coming up that connects us all to the work that you're doing or to the conversation that you're having? Are you finding some patterns among us?
Yes. And I believe that those patterns have greatly informed my questioning. The biggest thread that I've come across with all those episodes, I would say, is the need to be in a space that is home. The need to be in a space of belonging, wherever that may be for that individual. So majority of the people who are on the podcast are women of color, and that's on purpose, right? And majority of them come on the podcast and they always have a story about how they're being ostracized, how they were going through their schooling as a third culture kid, and they were trying to figure out how they can fit in and how they can make sense of where they are in life. I've had stories of trauma. I've had stories of identity-based harm in many different forms and manifestations. So all those things have happened on this platform. And I believe this is the place where people feel comfortable enough to open up, because I'm not one that's going to interrupt you from sharing your truth. If anything, this is a place where you're going to get the affirmations, you're going to get your flowers, and you're not going to be questioned or interrogated in a way that delegitimizes your life experience. And that's something that happens in our schools, unfortunately. When you try to let them know that you're experiencing identity-based harm, They want to try to white-splain or make an excuse to let you know why you're overreacting. Like, you don't need to trip like that. Like, they didn't mean it the way they said it. Like, I've had those moments during my own teaching career. So this may be the only place where educators can come and vent and emote and unleash.
It's like therapy, like I said.
Well, it's interesting that you said, this common thread. That's how Maymouna and I got together. Our group is called From the Margins, right? We're for the margins. It's like, this is the one, even before we knew each other, we're like, we can look at each other and know exactly
what the story is going to be.
The story in that space is that we're coming from. So I love that your guests can share that experience, because oftentimes you are alone, but here are 200 people who you can connect with and network. And I love that it's a network, not in the way of like capitalist Western society thinking about network, but more like this indigenous sort of like web of support. Like, I'm just thinking of network in different terms when you say that word, other than like, how can I get a gig or something like that, as we think about it, but more of just being present for each other.
And it's also not networking where we're just comparing trauma bonds, because no one wants to do that. I think it's also, again, the affirmations that you're not alone. And also sometimes I think for the majority of the guests that you have brought up to the show, they're in different stages of their educational career, right? And so sometimes I think when you're new, everything is just glitzy and gold. And is this in my head? Is this really happening? And then you hear from someone who's been an educator for X amount of years, it's the same experience. So it's not a trauma bond, but it's also like, I think, an affirmation that here's the things that happen to me, and maybe this can help you to do things differently or to consider, or whatever it is that you need to take away from it. And that leads me to my next question. What do you feel, and I feel like maybe you touched upon it a little bit, what do you feel has been the biggest takeaway or the biggest learning experience for you through this podcast?
The biggest learning experience, I would say, is not to judge a book by its cover. I know it sounds cliche, but you can't judge people by how they look. And this is true. We all have these implicit biases about different people from different backgrounds. I have them, you have them, we all have them, right? But the thing that this podcast has taught me is the importance of research. The importance of honoring somebody's time. And this is where Dr. Gholdy Muhammad talks about the importance of criticality, right? When you're doing research and you're looking at different sources of information, you're not just taking what's there at face value. You're not just staying in these echo chambers. You're taking time to get to learn from different people. I was watching day 3 of the Democratic National Convention, and D.L. Hughley came up and he had a story about how he was wrong about Kamala Harris and her record as an attorney. And he said, I didn't do my research before making these assertions about who she is. And for that, I'm sorry. See, on this podcast, before I interview anybody, I'm the one that's going to be stalking your social media accounts. I'm going to listen to your podcast from other platforms. I'm going to be on your LinkedIn, look at your profile to see your whole work history. I'm going to go on your Twitter or X and look at your past tweets. That's just me. I'm that nosy, because ultimately I want people to get to know the full spectrum of who you are as a human. And I think that's been the greatest gift of doing this podcast, is having that ability to be able to explore one's full humanity and also platform it in a way that allows for others to learn something from that individual.
Thank you for that. Let's get into your book and writing. Let's get into that.
Again, you were mentioning Miss Martin must have been such a great teacher, because you were like, I was not a writer when I was young, but now here you are. Is it 2 or 3 books that you have published? Speaking of doing my research, I think it's 2.
2 and 1 on the way.
2 and 1 on the way, right?
Yep.
What inspired you to be an author? What made you like sit down and say, like, you know what, I'm just going to do this agonizing activity of writing a book and try to get it published?
You know what's funny? And I'm now having this epiphany as I'm talking to you all. All these things are happening when I'm having extended breaks from teaching in the classroom. So when I wrote Shape the Teacher Identity, my first book, I was on paternity leave. And it was a 3-month paternity leave. I took all my FMLA, everything, and was with my first son, who is now 6. And of course, I'm bored because I was that teacher who would show up to school every day. Didn't matter if I was coughing, had a broken leg. My behind was coming to school because I didn't trust any sub to come in and do what I do. And I didn't want to clean up after anybody's mess. I was that teacher. Yes, I will acknowledge that. So it was the first time that I was sitting still in quite a while. And at that point, I was in year 9 of teaching. And I thought, it would be cool to write a book about all these lessons I've learned over these 9 years. So my wife and I have a friend who had just released a book around that time. We had gone to her book launch and we just saw how cool she presented everything and went through the whole process. And in the back of my mind, I thought, this is something that I want to do. It'll be a way to kill time over these 3 months while I'm taking a break from changing diapers and doing all the things you do as a new father. And I just started to write. I was going on YouTube, learning what a manuscript is.
Wow.
I was learning what it meant to edit. I was asking questions from my author friends who had been through the process, just getting advice from wherever I got it from. And honestly, my first editor was someone from Fiverr.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't know about Fiverr and all these outsourcing platforms until I started writing the book. So the way I did it was very much from the ground up, self-published, made a lot of mistakes in the process. But funny thing is, this is a book that people still buy to this day. I actually will be talking with the university in the next week to talk about Shape the Teacher Identity. And this is a book that I wrote almost 6 years ago. And it's still a book that's relevant, particularly for pre-service educators. But all this happened while I was on break, just like the podcast happened while I was on a teaching break. So there is a recurring theme there.
Well, I mean, rest is resistance, right? We talk about this all the time. And so this is your contribution to the resistance. But in order for you to be able to be fully present for that, I think those breaks had to happen. And I'm wondering, sort of an extension of the first question that MaryAnn asked, thinking about who you were as a youngster and the fact that there was no interest in writing and all these other things, literacy was not your strongest. I'm thinking about your writing style, right? And the content that you are writing about. It's all still connected, in my opinion, to the theme of belonging and identity and things like that, rooted in my opinion, the experiences that you've had as a youngster up until this point. Is it accurate to say that there is that influence for sure with your writing style and the content that you're writing?
Absolutely. Going back to my own childhood, you always want to be in the in crowd. That's the belonging piece.
Right.
Always trying to be in the in crowd. I didn't want to be considered a student with special needs. I wanted to be a student who was considered regular, whatever that means. I didn't want to be associated with anything that was special education. So that meant riding the school bus. That meant sitting in the back seat because that's where all the cool people sat. That meant listening to the music that everybody else was listening to. I just always wanted to be with the in crowd.
I wanted to know, when you do a podcast, when you write several books, you are in front of people, you are sharing your voice. Where do you find that confidence to be like, you know what, I'm just going to put this out there because I have this idea? And I mean, that takes a lot of confidence.
And a lot of courage,
And where do you find that?
I think the courage comes from the fact that I've had my reps. Whenever I do a podcast, that's the equivalent of going to the gym. I'm getting my reps in. So that when I go into a public setting and I have to talk to a bigger crowd, I can lean on the experience. I can lean on the practice, the hours that I've put in to prepare for this moment and just go out there and be me.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Like when you all me at the ALOC conference and I just went on that whole soliloquy,
Yeah.
that wasn't planned. I was totally jet lagged at that time, but I trusted my experience of podcasting and hosting, and that allowed me to deliver what you all ultimately saw. But I don't believe it would have happened that way had I not had those reps leading up to that moment.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
I love that. Practice builds confidence for sure.
I love that too.
Yes.
And also, for as much as you were wanting and longing for that belonging piece and wanting to be sort of in the in crowd, I think what makes you so unique is that you do stand out, Kwame. I mean, and I think it's a beautiful thing. And in thinking about your new book, Learning to Relearn, Supporting Identity in a Culturally Affirming Classroom, as an educator who stands out as a podcaster, and I'm sure you want this book to stand out as well, what would you say are some similarities and differences between the books that you previously wrote and this one?
Well, with the first couple books, I was doing a lot of trial and error. I was still learning how to be an author. I was still going through the ropes. This book, I believe, is my thesis. If I was in a doctoral program, this would be my dissertation. When I think about the progression from Shape the Teacher Identity up until Learn to Relearn, I've grown so much as a human. I've learned a whole lot from a lot of different people that the knowledge base that I have now is so significant compared to what it was back in 2019. So that allows me to talk about different types of topics with more depth because of all the years I've had to grow and build capacity. So I would say with Learn to Relearn, this is me at my most vulnerable state. This is me at my rawest state because I am uncovering truths that certain subgroups of people don't want me to share. And it's a book that I believe will be banned in many states. And I believe that's going to be a badge of honor. So it's that kind of book. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a book that's about humanity. It's a book that's about truth. It's a book that's about what it means to be a good human. That's how I would sum it up. And how teachers can be good humans to their students and others around them in the school setting.
Wow. Well, if all the listeners have now stopped pausing the recording, and I'm going off to order the book or pre-order that book. When will it come out officially?
So the release date right now is November 15th.
Okay.
But folks can pre-order the book on Amazon and the Routledge website. It's available.
Fantastic. I can't wait. I can't wait to read it. Maybe we need to do a book club, Maymouna.
I think it's a good idea.
I think so.
That's the next thing.
That's the next thing.
Oh, don't worry. It's going to happen. I've been talking with Kevin. So Kevin and I have already been talking about that.
Great.
I've also been talking with ISS.
Yeah, for their book talk series.
Doing one as well.
Well, that's fantastic.
Don't worry. Those book talks are coming for sure.
Okay, good. Sure. I have one follow-up before we kind of wrap it up a little bit. This third book that you're writing, did it follow the trend where the writing and the inspiration happened during a break period? I'm curious about that. Absolutely.
All these books have been written when I was not in the classroom. So I actually had the time, like you said, to process and reflect and do deep dives on all these different issues I share in the book.
And how long did the writing process start from beginning to end for this new one?
So for this new book, I started the writing process in 2021, about spring 2021, and I stopped writing the book late 2023 and submitted it for production in February of this year. So it took about 3 years to get it from start to finish.
So that's a nod to all the upcoming authors. If it doesn't happen tomorrow, be patient. Be consistent.
Yes.
Keep going, because you have something to say. If it doesn't get said overnight, it doesn't mean that there's not an opportunity later on.
And thank you for mentioning that, because the one thing that I learned through this process, which I knew already, but when you're in it, you really learn it, is that sometimes there'll be days where all you have is one word to write. Some days it might be a paragraph. Some days it may be, MaryAnn, you know this. You did a whole doctorate. You know how you write a dissertation. You trying to do that thesis. You're doing that lit review.
Yeah.
There's so many things that have to happen in the process. And then on top of that, there are certain protocols that you have to go through with your publisher. So there's peer review. There's sensitivity reads, because I'm talking about multiple identities. So I need to make sure that I don't say anything that's so controversial that I can get myself in trouble or get a lawsuit.
Right.
There's also your editing team. You also have a production team that works on the aesthetics of the book, the formatting, the color, the page setup. So these are all moving parts that are happening simultaneously. And you have to navigate all of that as the author and make some executive decisions. But the thing that takes the longest time is the editing. The editing is what makes this process take the longest time, because not just one round. I must have went through, I don't know, maybe 9-10 rounds of edits.
Wow.
I lost count after a while because there was so many edits. That's what takes the most time.
Right.
Again, that motivation, that drive to keep going. I think I would have been just like done. To wrap up.
I was too deep in it. I was too deep.
Right. Well, I know you got to finish it. You can't.
I got to finish now.
Hanging. You can't leave things hanging. That's another immigrant value there. No half-assed jobs, right? I think I don't know who said that. Was that Kamala Harris at the DNC? I was laughing so hard when it was just like, yeah, her mom was like, "All right, don't do a half-ass." Right. Which now I tell my children, you can't do a half job. So I'm gonna say half-ass when they get a little bit older. Okay, to wrap up, actually, speaking of children, we know that you are a father of 2 young, beautiful scholars. How have your experiences informed their educational journey? How are you coaching them through their time as a young students in school?
Well, before I could do that, I had to do the work on myself. And I'm still doing the work on myself. So over the past couple of years, I've been real invested in doing therapy, doing emotional intelligence classes with my wife and also individually. And during that time, I had to confront my own childhood trauma. And a lot of it is centered around my father. So my father and I, we don't have much of a relationship. And we were estranged for a very long time because I was so angry with him. And this is something that's common in a lot of African households. So in a lot of African households, if you have a mom and dad who clearly aren't feeling each other, more times than not, they're not going to divorce. They'll stay together and they'll have some arrangement as to how the relationship's going to go moving forward. But in the case of my mom and dad, I didn't grow up with a template of what a healthy marriage looked like. I didn't learn that from them because they didn't like each other. I'm going to keep it a buck. But I did learn from my mom how to be empathetic. I learned how to gentle parent. I got my dad in me too. So I do have those moments where dad comes out and I have to acknowledge that. But I think the trauma that I talk about was something I had to deal with through therapy. I had to unpack it. I had to finally have a face-to-face with my father and say, hey, this is how you caused harm to me when I was this age, that age, and this age. I had to go through a whole timeline just to get out of my system. And it's not, and you don't do it expecting an apology. You do it so that you can bring closure to the situation so you can be the best person you can be for your family. So in my case, my sons, my wife, and all my other. And that was something I had to come to terms with. But for the longest time, I didn't want to talk to that man. My wife would tell me, you should call your dad. I'd be like, nah, I ain't talking to him. But then going through the emotional intelligence classes and having someone else say the same thing your wife said a zillion times, now it's like, oh, okay, I guess I really have to, because this is going to have a detrimental impact to my family if I don't address it now. So that was the starting point. And then now I realized I want to be the father that I didn't have growing up. Like, my father was present physically, but emotionally he wasn't there. And there were a lot of things that he did that really that really impacted me. Like the way he treated my mom, the abuse that I experienced, the emotional abuse. In some cases, it was even physical. Not towards her, but even like towards myself and some of my siblings. So these are things that really happened. It was something that I had to forgive him for so that I can move on, because that anger stays with you for a while. Now, remember when I told you about this need to have to prove yourself to people? Well, in the case of my father, he was the one that would call me stupid if I didn't get a question right or if my grades weren't as high as everybody else. So, of course, you grew up thinking, I'm gonna prove this man wrong. And then you get into those college years where you're trying to get rent money, you're trying to get money for this next semester so that you can register for classes and not get kicked out of school. And your father calls you and says, hey, I don't have any money. Ask your mom, but your mom's working 3 jobs, in some cases 4 different jobs, just to make ends meet and take care of not just yourself, but your 2 other siblings who have also gone through college. That was the real. So after a while, once I saw that he could not be dependable, I cut him off and said, I'm going to keep on going this journey dolo. And I've done it to a fault, because when you don't allow people to help you, it could lead to some bad situation because that stubbornness comes in. And it was something that I had to unlearn. I had to learn how to just let people come in and help. And it's still something I need to learn. I mean, even though I'm better now, it's still something that I got to deal with. But I know that it comes from my dad. That side comes from my dad. And I would not have made that connection had I not gone through the therapy and through the emotional intelligence classes and all the other work that I've had to do and still continue to do. So as a parent, I just try to do the best I can to be present for both of my sons. And I always remind myself of what kind of father I don't want to be. I want to be a present father, an emotionally present father. I want to be a physically present father. I want to affirm my kid and not put them down. I want them to see what's possible on the negative. All the things that I didn't get from my dad, I want to give to my sons. And that's something that I take very seriously. And I'm very thankful that they're able to have a much healthier start to their childhood than I did. And I just hope that it continues to go up that trajectory.
And it will, by the grace of whatever we all believe in, it will, because you've laid down the pieces to be able to have that healthy start continue into a fruitful young adult and successful adult life for the 2 of them. So kudos to you for doing that work. I think a lot of people, men and women, I think they're walking around with their trauma. Some of them don't even realize it's there. Some of them realize and they don't care. And then some of them just are too afraid to even confront it. And so they're just walking around breaking homes and hearts. And so kudos to you for leaning into that and recognizing that you got to be here for your kids. So whatever it takes,
That's
you're
right.
doing. Our last question to wrap it up. In thinking about everything that we talked about over this hour with you, hour plus, thanks for your time again. What is one piece of advice or one lesson? You got to bring it down to 1, Kwame. That you would have wanted
one lesson?
to tell, one lesson or one piece of advice that you would have wanted to tell your younger self. What would that have been?
What would I tell my younger self? I would say that don't always believe what people tell you about who you are. When you believe in what people say about you, you give those people power that they don't deserve to have.
I love that.
I love that too. And I mean, it's a great ending to how that also leads into your identity, giving that power to someone.
Your book.
Yeah.
It's like the theme there, right? Because you're giving people space to talk about who they believe they are and nobody else.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us. I think we could just go on into the evening and just keep talking and sharing. And I think it's such a wonderful space that you've given to the universe, to us educators, to Maymouna and I. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
And thank you all for pushing me to do this. This is something that was a long time coming. I'm glad that you 2 were the ones to manage this conversation. So I appreciate y'all.
And we appreciate you. So keep going forward and onward. And it all works out in the end. That's my thing. It always does. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so let me go ahead and put my host hat on and close it out properly. So, people, you've heard it first. You got I would say about 90% of the story. There's always never enough time to share everything, but it's all good though. And I hope that you learn something new about me and you take away something that's going to allow you to be a better person. So, on behalf of Dr. MaryAnn DeRosa and Maymouna Sakho, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, a good night wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.